Fire Captain Engineering, situation critical.
All available personnel on the double. Spock with me.
Picture this. It is the summer of 1966. America is caught in the grip of the Cold War. The Vietnam War is escalating. Civil rights protesters are marching in the streets. And somewhere in Hollywood, a television writer named Gene Roddenberry is trying to convince a skeptical network that audiences want to watch a show about humans flying through space, making friends with aliens, and building a better future for all of mankind. The network is doubtful. The budget is a disaster. The pilot has already been rejected once. And yet, on September 8, 1966, Star Trek premieres on NBC, and nothing in science fiction, or television, or popular culture would ever quite be the same again. But here is the thing about Star Trek that most people never fully appreciate. The polished, optimistic vision of the future that the show projected onto millions of television screens every week was built on a foundation of chaos, compromise, near disasters, and last-minute improvisations that would have killed a lesser production stone dead. The gap between what the show appeared to be and what was actually happening behind the scenes is one of the most fascinating stories in television history. So today, we are going to close that gap. These are 20 weird, surprising, and largely untold facts about Star Trek, the original series, the show that almost never existed, told by a cast that almost didn't stay, broadcast by a network that almost pulled the plug, and remembered by a generation that wasn't even watching when it first aired. Every mythology needs its hero. For Star Trek, that hero turned out to be Captain James T. Kirk, played by William Shatner, with a particular swagger that became so iconic it eventually became self-parody, and then looped back around to being genuinely beloved again. But Shatner was not Roddenberry's first choice, not even close. When Roddenberry pitched the show to NBC and filmed the original pilot, the captain of the Enterprise was a man named Christopher Pike, played by Jeffrey Hunter. Hunter was a bona fide Hollywood name, a leading man who had played Jesus Christ in the 1961 biblical epic King of Kings. He was serious, handsome, and carried a brooding intensity that gave the pilot a distinctly philosophical weight. Roddenberry was pleased. NBC was interested. And then Hunter walked away from the project entirely before the second pilot was filmed. The exact reasons have been debated for decades. Some accounts suggest Hunter's wife, who also managed his career, felt that starring in a television series would damage his film career standing. Other accounts suggest he simply felt the material wasn't right for him. Whatever the reason, he exited, and Roddenberry was left looking for a new captain. He found Shatner, and the entire personality of the show shifted. Where Hunter's Pike had been inward and contemplative, Shatner's Kirk was electric, impulsive, and theatrical. The show gained an energy it had been missing. Tragically, Jeffrey Hunter died in 1969 at only 42 years old, following complications from a stroke. He never got to witness what Star Trek ultimately became, or to know that his performance as Pike is still considered one of the finest hours the franchise ever produced. Leonard Nimoy's Spock, with those angular eyebrows, pointed ears, and greenish complexion, is one of the most recognizable character designs in television history. But Roddenberry's earliest written descriptions of the character looked almost nothing like what ended up on screen. In his initial conceptual notes, Roddenberry described Spock as having reddish skin, a deliberately unsettling, almost demonic quality that would signal his alien nature immediately and viscerally. Early design sketches pushed hard in that direction. The intent was to make Spock genuinely alien-looking, not merely a human with unusual ears. Then the production team ran headlong into a practical problem. In 1966, the majority of American households were still watching television on black and white sets. Red skin, when translated to a monochrome image, would render as dark, dangerously close to the skin tones of black actors on screen, at a time when that visual association carried serious and loaded implications. The decision was made to shift to a subtle greenish-yellow tint that would suggest alienness while remaining clearly distinct in any format. The irony is that on color televisions, the tint was so understated that most viewers barely registered it at all. The pointed ears ended up doing most of the communicative work. But for a brief, strange moment in pre-production, Mr. Spock might have looked like something out of a horror picture. The transporter is perhaps the single most philosophically interesting piece of technology Star Trek ever invented. The idea that you can disassemble a human being at the subatomic level, convert them into an energy stream, and reconstruct them somewhere else, perfectly intact, memories and personality and all, raises questions about identity and consciousness that philosophers are still chewing on. Scientists at reputable universities have conducted experiments in quantum teleportation inspired by the concept. It is a genuinely audacious piece of imaginative world-building. It is also, at its origin, a solution to a cash flow problem. Roddenberry's original plan called for the Enterprise crew to travel between their ship and planetary surfaces via shuttlecraft, small vessels that would be shown landing, taking off, and navigating terrain. It would have looked spectacular and grounded the show's universe in a satisfying physical logic. It would also have required building and filming elaborate model sequences and location shoots that the production budget simply could not support. The production team needed a way to move characters from the ship to a planet's surface quickly, cheaply, and without showing any vehicles. The solution they devised was the transporter, a special effect achieved by filming sparkling dust or crystals falling in front of a black velvet background, then reversing and superimposing the footage over an actor who was slowly crouching below the frame. Total cost, minimal. Total cultural impact, immeasurable. Today the transporter is so embedded in popular imagination that the word teleportation is almost impossible to hear without thinking of Star Trek first. Television networks do not, as a rule, give second chances. When a pilot fails, it fails, and the project dies. The development of new network programming is expensive and time-consuming, and a failed pilot is typically considered money already wasted rather than a foundation worth building on. This makes what NBC did with Star Trek genuinely unusual in the history of American broadcasting. The original pilot, titled The Cage, was delivered to NBC in late 1965. The network's response was unenthusiastic in a very specific way. Their criticism wasn't that the show was bad, exactly, but that it was wrong. Too slow. Too intellectual. Too focused on ideas rather than action. And the presence of a female first officer, number 1, played by Majel Barrett, seemed to strike certain executives as implausible and, for some, simply unwelcome. Rather than killing the project outright, NBC commissioned a second pilot. This almost never happens. Roddenberry rewrote extensively, reconfigured the cast, amplified the action, and brought in William Shatner. The result is what became the series we know. But Roddenberry kept The Cage close. He reworked its footage into a two-part episode called The Menagerie, which used the original pilot as a story within a story. That episode won the Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation in 1967, making the rejected pilot, indirectly, one of the most decorated hours in the show's history. When Star Trek premiered, Nichelle Nichols was doing something that had essentially no precedent on mainstream American primetime television. As Lieutenant Uhura, she occupied a position of authority and competence on the bridge of a starship, a professional role, not a servile one, at a time when black women on television were almost exclusively confined to domestic or supporting parts. The significance of that representation is difficult to overstate given the cultural context of the late 1960s. Despite that significance, or perhaps partly because she was close enough to it that she couldn't fully see it, Nichols made the decision, after the first season, to leave the show. Broadway was calling, and she had serious theatrical ambitions. She informed Gene Roddenberry of her intention to resign. Then she attended a civil rights fundraiser and was told that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wished to speak with her. King, it turned out, was a devoted fan of the show, and he had something urgent to say. He told her that Uhura was not just a character, she was proof, broadcast into living rooms across America every week, that black women belonged in positions of leadership and dignity. He told her she could not leave, because what she was doing mattered in a way that transcended entertainment. Nichols later recounted that she returned to Roddenberry's office the following Monday morning and withdrew her resignation. She remained with the franchise for decades. The conversation with King, she said, was one of the defining moments of her life. It is almost impossible now to imagine anyone other than Leonard Nimoy playing Spock. The character and the actor became so thoroughly fused that Nimoy spent much of his later life contemplating where he ended and Spock began, a question he addressed in not one but two autobiographies, the first titled I Am Not Spock and the second, years later, I Am Spock. The journey between those two titles is a story in itself. But in the early days of production, Nimoy approached the role with significant apprehension. His primary concern was visual. He worried that the pointed ears and artificially tinted skin would make Spock read as monstrous rather than sympathetic. He feared the character would become a novelty, a rubber-suited alien curiosity rather than a figure audiences could genuinely connect with emotionally. There was also a deeper professional challenge. Nimoy was a trained actor with a full emotional range, and Spock required him to suppress that range almost entirely. Playing a being who had rigorously excised emotion from his behavior meant Nimoy had to find ways to communicate depth and interiority through the smallest possible signals, a fractional shift in posture, a microsecond of hesitation, the precise angle of a raised eyebrow. He had to learn an entirely new vocabulary of restrained performance. What convinced him to stay, ultimately, was the audience reaction. Viewers did not see a monster. They saw something far more interesting, a character who felt everything and showed nothing, and who was more affecting for that discipline than most openly emotional characters ever managed to be. On November 22, 1968, Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura kissed on screen in the episode, Plato's Stepchildren. It is widely recognized as one of the first interracial kisses broadcast on American primetime television, and at the time it aired, the country was less than 5 years removed from the legal prohibition of interracial marriage in multiple states. The cultural weight of that moment was enormous. What is less widely known is how hard the network worked to prevent it from meaning what it meant, and how the actors fought back. NBC's position was that the kiss needed to be framed as involuntary. The characters were being controlled by telekinetic alien beings, which would provide network affiliates in the American South with grounds to dismiss the scene as not a genuine expression of affection between the characters. The network wanted shots filmed both ways, with and without the kiss actually occurring, so that affiliates could choose which version to broadcast. Shatner and Nichols, understanding exactly what was at stake, reportedly flubbed every take in which they were supposed to keep their faces apart, making those shots unusable. The director had no choice but to use the take where they turned toward each other and made contact. The network got its telekinetic disclaimer in the script. The actors got the moment they had fought for on screen. Nichols later shared a letter she received from a white Southern viewer who told her that the scene had profoundly challenged his assumptions about race. One carefully sabotaged take of a scene in a science fiction television program had cracked something open in a human being's worldview. Star Trek was not a rating success during its original run. This is a fact worth sitting with, because the show's cultural stature has grown so enormous in the decades since that it can be difficult to remember that contemporary audiences were, at best, modestly interested. The network was unconvinced throughout the show's run that it was worth the resources being devoted to it. After the first season, cancellation was discussed seriously at NBC. After the second season, the discussion became louder and more urgent. What happened next was genuinely without clear precedent in broadcasting history. Fans organized, and they did so without the internet, without social media, without any of the digital infrastructure that makes fan mobilization seem almost trivially easy today. Petitions circulated on university campuses, passed hand to hand. Letters were written, estimates run into the hundreds of thousands, possibly past 1 million pieces of correspondence arriving at NBC's offices across the two campaigns. Demonstrators gathered outside network headquarters. The passion was visible and impossible to ignore. It worked, twice. The show was renewed, and NBC actually made a public announcement of the renewal at a fan convention, an extraordinary acknowledgement that audience advocacy had directly reversed a business decision. The third season arrived, underfunded and buried in an unfavorable time slot, but it arrived. And the episode count it provided gave the show what it needed to qualify for syndication. Syndication is where Star Trek truly came to life. The fans who saved the show from cancellation had, without knowing it, saved the entire future of the franchise. The USS Enterprise, NCC 1701, is one of the most recognizable spacecraft ever designed. The 11-foot filming model that appeared throughout the original series was a masterwork of detailed craftsmanship for its era, with carefully painted hull sections, precisely constructed nacelles, and a saucer section that communicated both elegance and power. It is now preserved at the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., where it is treated with the reverence usually accorded to actual spacecraft. If you were somehow able to flip that model over and examine its underside, you would find something considerably less impressive. The bottom of the model, the surfaces that never appeared in camera shots because every filming angle was composed from above or the side, was left largely unfinished. Unpainted in sections. Rough where the visible surfaces were precise. The production team allocated their time and budget exclusively to what the audience could actually see, and not a moment or dollar more. It is a perfect metaphor for television production under financial constraint, and also, in a strange way, for the show itself. Star Trek projected an image of completeness, sophistication, and futuristic grandeur that its actual production circumstances in no way supported. The magic was entirely in the visible surface. The underside was always a work in progress. Beam me up, Scotty. 4 words. 50 years on bumper stickers, coffee mugs, t-shirts, and greeting cards. A phrase so culturally embedded that astronauts aboard the International Space Station used it as a tribute when James Doohan, the actor who played engineer Montgomery Scott, passed away in 2005. A line so associated with Star Trek that it functions as shorthand for the entire franchise. It appears nowhere in the original series. Not once. Not in any episode, in any form. What Kirk actually says in various episodes includes, "Beam us up, Scotty, Scotty, beam me up, Enterprise, beam me up," and other close variations, but the specific forward sequence that became universally famous was never assembled in that order in the original run. The cultural memory of the quote diverged from the recorded reality, and the diverged version became more famous than anything that was actually said. This phenomenon has a name in media studies, the Mandela effect when applied to misremembered shared cultural touchstones, and Star Trek is far from the only example. "Play it again, Sam," was never said in Casablanca. "Elementary, my dear Watson," does not appear in Arthur Conan Doyle's original stories. Darth Vader says, "No, I am your father," not, "Luke, I am your father." But the Star Trek case is particularly striking because the invented phrase became more culturally durable than any genuine line from the show. Sometimes the legend simply overwrites the truth, and no amount of archival evidence can put it back. Star Trek presented its audiences with a galaxy teeming with alien civilizations, each with distinct cultural aesthetics, ceremonial traditions, and fashion sensibilities. Week after week, the Enterprise encountered beings from distant worlds who dressed in exotic garments that seemed to speak to entirely alien cultures and histories. The wardrobe department appeared to be working overtime to populate the universe with convincingly otherworldly visual design. In reality, the wardrobe department was primarily raiding storage. Hollywood studios in the 1960s maintained colossal costume archives accumulated over decades of film production. Biblical epics, westerns, medieval adventures, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, all of it was sitting in warehouses, catalogued and available. Star Trek's costume team used these archives extensively. Roman togas became alien ceremonial robes. Frontier-era Western clothing became the dress of distant planetary civilizations. Old science fiction B-movie suits received new paint jobs and alien insignia. Medieval armor was repurposed and accessorized into something ostensibly interstellar. Sharp-eyed viewers occasionally caught the recycling, a garment that had appeared in a recognizable form in another production showing up on an alien world with minor modifications. The costume team's genuine skill lay not in original fabrication but in transformation, taking familiar materials and recontextualizing them so effectively that they read as alien within the world of the show. On television, viewed in a living room on a small screen rather than in a cinema, the illusion only needs to hold for seconds at a time. It held. The phaser, Starfleet's standard-issue sidearm, capable of stunning, incapacitating, or disintegrating targets depending on the setting, became one of the most iconic prop weapons in science fiction history. Its clean, futuristic line suggested a weapon designed by a civilization that had moved beyond crude ballistics into something more elegant and more terrifying simultaneously. The prop department's starting point was a collection of plastic ray guns from the studio's existing inventory, novelty items and low-budget props from previous, less distinguished productions. These were modified, repainted, fitted with new components, given additional details to push them towards something more plausible as the weaponry of an advanced civilization. The results had a slightly toy-like quality under very close inspection, but on camera with proper lighting and the now iconic sound effects layered in, they read as genuinely futuristic. The genuine irony is what happened afterward. The phaser went on to inspire real-world weapons research. The United States military has invested considerably over the decades in directed energy weapons programs, laser-based systems designed to disable targets through concentrated energy beams rather than projectiles. The conceptual lineage from a repainted toy gun on a 1960s television budget to serious military research programs is not a straight line, but it is a real one. The Trouble with Tribbles, broadcast in December 1967, is widely considered one of the finest episodes of the entire original series, a masterfully constructed comic episode in which the Enterprise is overrun by small, round, endlessly reproducing fuzzy creatures whose only discernible activities are eating, purring, and producing more tribbles. It is funny, cleverly plotted, and genuinely charming. It is also the episode that turned the set into a static electricity hazard. The tribble props were constructed by stretching synthetic fur over foam spheres, with small vibrating motors inserted into some of them to simulate the purring effect. Under normal circumstances, they were straightforward props. Under the intense heat of 1960s television studio lighting, which ran considerably hotter than modern LED systems, the synthetic fur became a static electricity generation mechanism of remarkable efficiency. Tribbles adhered to actors' costumes mid-scene. They clung to set furniture. They attached themselves to camera equipment. Crew members received small but unpleasant shocks with surprising regularity. The more the props were handled, and the episode required handling very large numbers of them, the more severe the static buildup became. The production team had to develop protocols for discharging the props between takes and managing their exposure to studio lighting to keep the situation from becoming genuinely dangerous. That the episode emerged from this chaos as a polished, delightful piece of television is its own minor miracle. If you are familiar with geek culture in any form, you know what a red shirt is. The term refers to the disposable supporting character, the anonymous crew member who beams down to a dangerous planet alongside the main heroes and does not beam back up again. The sacrifice that conveys danger without requiring the show to harm anyone the audience has actually invested in. It is one of the most durable tropes in popular storytelling, referenced everywhere from academic papers on narrative structure to workplace discussions about who gets assigned the risky projects. Star Trek gave the trope its name and its visual grammar, but it did so almost accidentally. The show's uniform color system assigned red to the engineering and security departments, the crew members who were most frequently deployed into dangerous field situations. When minor characters in red uniforms accompanied the main cast on away missions, they did have a statistically notable tendency to die. Fan analysis of the episode-by-episode death count has confirmed what audiences absorbed intuitively: red shirt characters were disproportionately represented among casualties. The show never acknowledged this pattern explicitly. No character ever said, "Don't put on the red shirt." The visual grammar was absorbed unconsciously, episode by episode, season by season, until it became a cultural shorthand that has now outlasted the show by more than 50 years and migrated far beyond science fiction fandom into the general language of storytelling and organizational dynamics. Ask anyone to name the signature antagonists of Star Trek, and the overwhelming majority will answer: the Klingon. The warrior culture, the honor code, the ridged foreheads, the eventually complex relationship with the Federation, the Klingon feel inseparable from what Star Trek is. They have their own constructed language with a grammar and vocabulary substantial enough to support original poetry and theatrical productions. They are, by any measure, one of the most fully realized invented cultures in science fiction. In the original series, they were secondary antagonists at best. The episode that most critics consider the finest hour of the original run, Balance of Terror, from the first season, features not Klingon but Romulans, presented as the primary strategic threat to the Federation. Secretive, calculating, and operating according to their own rigorous code of honor, the Romulans were constructed as a clearly deliberate Cold War allegory, an adversary defined by concealment, proxy conflict, and the terrifying uncertainty of what they might be capable of if pushed. It was sophisticated, politically charged storytelling. The Klingon appeared in later episodes as a more straightforward military threat, and they were popular, but they were one of several recurring adversary groups rather than the defining enemy the franchise would later make them. It was the feature films of the 1980s and Star Trek, The Next Generation, that elevated them to their current iconic status, retrospectively repositioning them in popular memory as the central villains of the original show. The actual original series was more complicated than its reputation suggests. Captain Kirk's reputation is built on gut instinct. He beats the unwinnable scenario, overrides the computer's probability assessments, makes the call that no machine would ever make, and turns out to be right. This is the core of his character, and it was not an accident. It was a deliberate creative and philosophical decision by the show's writers and producers. The ship's computer functions throughout the series as a foil specifically designed to make Kirk look heroic by contrast. The computer speaks in probabilities and statistical projections. Mission failure is likely, the logical course of action produces unacceptable losses, historical precedent suggests success is improbable. And then Kirk overrides it, acts on instinct and moral intuition, and succeeds. Every time. This was Star Trek making an argument, a very specific argument, about the relationship between human judgment and machine calculation, between intuition and data, between the irreducibly personal nature of moral decision-making and the cold optimization of algorithmic systems. In 1966, as mainframe computers were beginning to enter public consciousness and the first anxieties about machine intelligence were starting to surface, this was a pointed intervention in an emerging cultural conversation. In 2024 and beyond, as artificial intelligence becomes embedded in medical diagnosis, judicial sentencing, hiring decisions, and military targeting, that same argument is being rehearsed at civilizational scale. Star Trek was not predicting this moment so much as it was encoding a set of values about it, values that are now considerably more urgent than they were when the episodes first aired. Gene Roddenberry was trying to do something ambitious and potentially career-ending on network television in the late 1960s. He was trying to make political art. The America in which Star Trek aired was convulsed by the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, urban unrest, political assassination, and the deepest kind of cultural division. Network censors were vigilant about anything that seemed to directly engage with these realities. Direct engagement was dangerous. Roddenberry's solution was allegory, deliberate, sustained, and occasionally quite blunt allegory. If you set your story about racial hatred on another planet, with alien beings whose racial division is rendered in explicitly visual, almost absurdist terms, you can say things about American racial politics that would be cut from any script set in contemporary America. If you want to make an episode about the futility and mutual destruction of war, you set it on a planet where two civilizations have been fighting for centuries and no one can remember why. If you want to address political corruption, you find an alien society structured to illustrate the point. The episode, Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, in which humanoid aliens are divided against each other by which side of their faces is black and which is white, is perhaps the least subtle example of this approach. But the method ran throughout the show's entire run. The censors found it considerably more difficult to object to metaphors than to direct political statement. The science fiction wrapper was not incidental to the show's social purpose. It was the mechanism that made the social purpose possible. Not everything in the history of Star Trek's original production is philosophically significant or politically important. Some of it is simply strange. And among the stranger artifacts of the era is the Christmas album that the cast recorded during production, a project so peculiar that it spent years circulating as a bootleg before eventually receiving something approaching an official existence. The album featured cast members performing holiday material in ways that reflected their characters and personalities to varying degrees of self-awareness. William Shatner brought his signature dramatic commitment to the project, delivering material in the heightened, portentous style that was both entirely sincere and entirely unaware of how theatrical it sounded to outside ears. Leonard Nimoy performed a spoken-word piece with the same measured gravity he brought to Spock, treating the material as though it were of genuine cosmic significance. Other cast members contributed with various degrees of enthusiasm and varying levels of festive sincerity. The album was not designed for wide commercial release. It existed initially as a promotional artifact, something to be distributed to fan clubs and used for marketing purposes rather than to compete seriously in the holiday music marketplace. It then effectively disappeared for a number of years. Bootleg copies began circulating among dedicated fans before any kind of official version became available. When it eventually resurfaced, it found an audience that appreciated it precisely for its combination of earnestness and inadvertent absurdity. It is now considered a cult item, strange, warm, and entirely characteristic of a production that took itself seriously in ways that frequently produced unexpected results. Everything you have seen described in this video, the special effects, the alien makeups, the elaborate set designs suggesting future